Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now whenever we look at mini PCs here on the channel, I like to try and do something different with each video. Today I want to compare the gaming performance of the 890M iGPU to the legendary RX 580. To do that we're using one of these. This is the Minisforum AI X1 Pro. It features an AMD Ryzen AI9 HX370 with 12 cores and 24 threads, 64 gigs of RAM and a 1TB M.2 SSD. It's also available in a 32/1TB configuration or with 96 gigs of RAM and a 2TB SSD. The RAM is not soldered and there are 3 SSD slots, so if you wanted one of these it would be worth checking if you could save money by opting for the base configuration, which at the time of this video costs £839 in pounds, and upgrading it yourself. Accessing the internals is as easy as removing a few screws. The AI X1 Pro is larger, or at least wider, than a lot of mini machines I've tested, but the power supply is internal with this one. There's no bulky power brick accompanying this system. In the box we get the power cable, HDMI cable, VESA mounting plate and a heatsink for another SSD. I feel like I've said SSD about a million times. There's also a vertical stand. Around the outside we have dual 2.5G LAN ports, HDMI display port, USB 4, USB 3.2, USB 2, 3.5mm audio, fingerprint sensor and Oculink for attaching an external GPU, something we'll cover another time. This won't allow a discrete card to reach its maximum potential, but it should provide better results than say USB 4 or Thunderbolt. I should also mention the dedicated Copilot button. Anyway, performance. I switched this machine to performance mode in the BIOS before running any tests, and even so it is very quiet at idle. And under load, noise levels remained very respectable. My laptop that I used to record the following gameplay was louder and all it was doing was running OBS. This is probably one of the quietest mini machines I've used. It remained quiet throughout my Cinebench R23 test, where it managed a multi and single score of 23,612 and 2022 respectively. For some context, my daily i7-12700F hits 21,852 and 1669. The Ryzen is super snappy for editing as well. DaVinci Resolve runs like a dream. This is helped by the 64 gigs of DDR5, though it's running at 5600 MHz as opposed to 7500 MHz that we've seen from other systems with soldered modules. Still, I prefer the freedom to upgrade, but we may not be getting the most from the 890M in some gaming scenarios. I'll move on to some comparisons shortly, but first, here is what the AI X1 Pro can do. I targeted at least 40 FPS initially to try and find a sweet spot between visuals and performance. Targeting 60 with this iGPU will mean too much of a graphical sacrifice in some cases. First of all, we have Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 at 1080p with medium and FSR quality. I've only mentioned which version of FSR I've used if the game has more than one. So for this one we saw 43 frames per second with a 1% low of 37 and a 0.1% low of 35. In Spider-Man 2 with 1080p and the low preset with FSR balanced, we hit 52 frames per second with a 1% low of 25 and a 0.1% low of 24. This is quite a stuttery game in general no matter the hardware I'm using, and I'm actually surprised it held up as well as it did with this hardware. We certainly saw better percentile lows than I was expecting. Counter-Strike 2 at 1080p low for 141 FPS. There was no point in turning things up higher to try and hit the best visuals I could while retaining 40 frames per second, because as an online first-person title like this, I think the higher the frame rate the better, and this was certainly a solid way to play. The Witcher 3 Next Gen 1080p high with FSR quality for 50 frames per second, a 1% low of 41 and a 0.1% low of 20. I was surprised that we could turn the preset up to high even if we did have to resort to FSR in order to hit at least the 40 FPS target, but we could always go with a lower preset and native AA. GTA 5 Enhanced has of course added ray tracing to the game, and I actually used the high RT preset here with FSR3 quality for 50 frames per second, a 1% low of 41 and a 0.1% low of 17. So a few dips and drops here and there, something that I've experienced with a few different hardware configurations. Cyberpunk 2077 at 1080p medium with FSR3 quality hit 44 frames per second, a 1% low of 32 and a 0.1% low of 27. Still looks pretty decent at medium in my opinion. Red Dead Redemption 2 to finalise at 1080p, of course, with the ultra textures and everything else set to medium for 45 FPS and some very consistent percentile lows, 38 and 34 respectively. Next, I wanted to see how this compared to the RX 580, a legendary 8GB AMD GPU that offered those with less to spend a solid 1080p gaming experience and still does in some titles. I'm using an i9-14900K capped at 125 watts, which is probably a bit better than the Ryzen, but the GPU in both cases is the limitation by far. I'm also using 64 gigs of 5600MHz DDR5. Same as the Mini PC uses, but obviously this is desktop RAM instead. To start, we have Kingdom Come 2 then. With the 890M, we saw 44 FPS, 1% low of 37 and a 0.1% low of 22, compared to the RX 580, which saw 62 FPS on average, a 1% low of 57 and a 0.1% low of 56. Spider-Man 2 surprisingly runs on the 580. It didn't up until about a couple of weeks ago. It used to just crash every time, but it wasn't actually that much better than the 890M. In fact, I'd prefer the experience on the 890M because it seemed to be less glitchy. We were getting like black flashes all over the place and just some missing textures in general, even with the same low preset. 38 for the 890M, a 1% low of 17 and a 0.1% low of 16, but 41 for the RX 580 with similar percentile lows. I've avoided all upscaling for these comparative results. Counter-Strike 2 is very hard to get side-by-side footage that's exactly the same, but I ran a custom benchmark for the results, which for the 890M hit 158 frames per second, a 1% low of 95 and a 0.1% low of 72. I actually prefer playing the game on the 890M as opposed to the 580 because although we saw a higher average, 199, just look at those percentile lows. It was quite a stuttery mess. I'm not sure why, but CS2 and the 580, well, they weren't playing nicely today. Whether this is because of a recent update or because the 580 hasn't received drivers for a while, I don't know. But that's another thing to consider. The 580 is pretty much end of life at this point. Not in terms of performance, of course, but in terms of support, it would seem. The Witcher 3, next gen, medium FXAA. The 890M hit 52 frames per second. Still a pretty respectable result, I think, with some decent percentile lows, 42 and 39. The 580, however, pulled ahead with 88 frames per second, a 1% low of 70 and a 0.1% low of 61. Back in GTA 5 Enhanced now at high with FSR3 set to native, we saw plus 50 FPS with the 890M, 51 to be exact, a 1% low of 41 and a 0.1% low of 24. With the RX 580 8GB, we saw 70 frames per second, so almost 20 FPS more, a 1% low of 62 and a 0.1% low of 46. In Cyberpunk 2077, there was about an 8 or 9 FPS difference, 45 frames per second for the 890M iGPU, a 1% low of 33 and a 0.1% low of 27. The RX 580, however, hit 53 frames per second, and this is probably a little worse off in terms of consistency. The 1% low was 40, but that 0.1% low was 12, and it actually felt a little worse to play on the 580 because of this. So the 890M offered a smoother experience, and if we wanted to, we could also enable ray tracing, which I have tried before, and I don't recommend because we have to implement some pretty heavy FSR upscaling and it can make things look pretty messy. To finalise then, Red Dead Redemption 2, 45 FPS on the 890M iGPU, but 65 FPS on the RX 580. This old card has still got it. In some cases, although the 890M didn't pull ahead, it certainly felt smoother to play. Overall though, performance-wise, the 580 still pulls ahead. But there we have it, another decent mini machine, this time with a little more upgradability. I'll leave a link to the product page. I think I'm done with the 890M for now. I probably said that last time, but I keep thinking of comparison ideas, and I can't move past the idea until I've actually tested it. As always, if it's pure gaming performance you're after, then you can definitely build something that will produce more frames per second for a lot less money. If you specifically want a powerful mini PC though, then the Ryzen 9 HX370 and 890M is a solid combo. Thanks for watching. Let me know your thoughts below, and I'll see you all next time.